Hello humans, welcome to Alien Robot Tiger, a podcast about you.
Imagine you, instilled with the dangerous elegance of a tiger, prowling through the dark. The human crowd parts before you like the understory of the jungle. You catch her scent, and she catches yours. The hunt is just beginning, but you both know how it will end. Crimson Roll, scent of power and confidence, available now. Visit tigermusk.com to order your bottle or find a retailer near you. Crimson Roll, because you deserve to roll.
I am Robot, and with me are Alien.
Hola.
And Tiger.
Shalom.
And today we're talking about history. Now, I myself, in my people's arena, we have something called logs. And logs are records of our functioning and what has happened in our programs, usually for the purposes of when things get screwed up, we can go back and review the logs and try and find out what screwed up, when, where, and how to fix it. Now, I understand that human history works somewhat the same way and somewhat differently. So perhaps if you have similarities or contrasts to that, that's a good place to jump off.
Well, I think an important thing to start off with is that the way humans store their quote-unquote logs or their is what they call memories. From what I understand, memory works quite different from the way your robot kind store information. Even when they do things like write down words and lines of their own code, the way they interact with that is different from how you would interact with your own internal logs and codes that you write down. It's much more, for lack of a better word, organic in both its flaws and its advantages.
And it has to go through their processing. It's not like this recording device, which doesn't have to think about what we're saying, it just implants it. Humans have to go through like a translation, and then it's like a secondary storage.
Yes, and that also leads to the side effect that every time that a human has to input this log, they will interpret it different from how another human will. Whereas like a lot of machines can be universalized, they can standardize, yes. It's reading these things is often standardized. With humans, there's been attempts to create standards that have been successful to certain degrees, but there is nothing to the equivalent of that. So every human, this process will look different. And hence the reason why the history itself is a very vague and blurry thing to humans, and to those even who observe humans.
I wonder if it's like I've heard in fiction writing, one of the goals for writers is to, I've heard master writers say, master the language you're writing in so you can learn how to break the rules of it. And so master writers know how to do it so well that they can not do the stuff that everybody else does.
I think it's interesting and valuable that you bring up fiction, because in English and in kind of Western cultures, we have this fiction-non-fiction divide. And in the rest of the organic consciousnesses of this planet, it's a blurry line. And I think history is perhaps the greatest example of how that blurry line doesn't hold anything in. Because any organic history, whether it's your own memory of your childhood or you reading Pliny the Elder, you are inventing and participating in a narrative about events, not necessarily a log of the events. Even if you're looking at, say, Sumerian grain logs, that's evidence for you to start building a story, because that by itself is not history, that's just data.
Kind of in the same way, if you look at a map is a way of visualizing the terrain, but an accurate map of the terrain can only be created by creating something as detailed as the terrain. So then you just have the terrain.
Indeed.
Kind of using, you said the word map that made me think of something. Do you know about the map territory distinction problem?
I don't think I've heard about it.
It's a phrase in philosophy called confusing the map for the territory. which is to take a representation of something, a map, and then confusing that for being the actual terrain that it represents. And to Tiger, would you say history how would you put history in that frame of map versus territory and the potential confusion between the two things?
So take the fiction example. You can pull up a map of Middle-earth, say, Lord of the Rings. That map doesn't help you navigate anywhere on this Earth, but it is also a map. And you could look at the things that Tolkien was referencing, the Norse sagas and English history, and there are maps that go along with those stories that do, or could, potentially help you find things on this planet. The same is true of the story of Lord of the Rings and the stories that he's referencing. Like, they're equally history in some sense. One is just referencing data from the planet you happen to be living on.
So he has this thing called the Silmarillion, which is actually kind of a written history of that world. So to make the story itself feel more grounded, he went back and invented languages and a history. Would you say human history would be in a similar way, the way that humans or other beings that have history, like computers we have logs? That's a way of grounding your present by looking at this past thing.
I think that's a very useful application of history, yes.
So it seems like one of the things that humans attempt to do with history is create something objective. Most conscious things are by their nature subjective. And I think that's one of the problems that science and other attempts by humans and other beings to agree on things. We were talking about governance previously. One of the problems that governance seeks to overcome is all the differences people have and disagreements. And so it seems like history is an attempt to objectify the past so that we can agree on it versus having subjective. If I say, last time we met, you were wearing this, and you say, no, I think I was wearing this. Now we have two subjective interpretations, but history would be saying, no, wait, we have a photograph where we implanted photons in a medium, and that gives evidence that, in fact, one of you is correct. Would you agree that that is kind of one of the aspects of history that is fundamental to it, the objectifying subjectivity?
Yes, I think that is an aspect of history. I would give kind of a comparison. I think history needs to be thought of in that there are multiple types of history. In the same way as philosophy, there is multiple types of truth, which could be a subject of its own. But you have sort of the idea that you have truth as correctness, truth as revealing, and truth as usefulness. I think the latter would sometimes be called pragmatic truth. And I think you could say history is the same way in that history has multiple functions that it serves, and trying to say that history is just this one thing is incorrect and kind of reductionistic. So I agree that what you said there is one aspect of history. The attempts to find clarity of the objective past. If you could allow me to use that word, which is a kind of problematic word to use.
There's a limited use to the objectivity of history. There's a time and a place for it, certainly. If it becomes necessary to know what Alien was wearing last week, it's nice to have a photograph. But there's a great deal of history that isn't concerned with or uses facts, air quotes, to support things that are more useful than facts.
Like what, for example?
Take, for a dramatic example, Karl Marx and the material dialectic kind of process of approaching history. There are plenty of facts that he presents, and some very insightful realizations that come from juxtaposing those facts. There are also some serious problems with extrapolating those facts in those juxtapositions into creating Soviet Russia.
So, as an example, you might have, say, building blocks for a larva, or they call them infants. Is that correct?
Yes.
So, you have a human larva, and perhaps you give them building blocks. And perhaps you notice that you build things out of these building blocks, and the toddler keeps knocking it down. You can consider those are facts. I have blocks, I give them to this infant, it knocks them down. And you could extrapolate, perhaps I should not build something, or perhaps this should not have blocks, but perhaps you could also extrapolate is this infant, this larva, is messing with my blocks and so should be exterminated.
Or you could conclude that these blocks should be glued together and destroy the joy of tumbling blocks.
I think you two stumbled upon something that I think is referred to as the underdetermination problem. That's what humans call it, which is where something happening and then how that thing happening is interpreted are two different things. So you could have two humans who have the exact same thing happen to them, and then they could basically both come to completely different conclusions about what does it mean, and, emphasis meaning with a capital M, what does this thing that just happened to us actually mean? That's something else that I think needs to be taken into account with history is we can talk about objective history all we like, but what does this objective history mean to the people who are looking at this objective thing?
And what did it mean to the people living it? And how will it ground future ways of being as we move forward?
Yes.
So if you're looking at it in a utilitarian way, which for my kind, almost everything is measured by some sort of optimization process. So it doesn't have utility, then it doesn't generally, you think of it as evolution, that if it doesn't have utility, that is a fitness function for most electronic life forms. So history would need to have some sort of utility. So say alien, you said there's many different types of aliens. Say you're going to another species or race or whatever you call it, classification or genre. I don't know how you even classify.
I like the word genre of alien.
Yeah, a different genre of aliens that don't utilize history or have never conceived of it. They have not invented history yet. And you're trying to take the human model of history and deliver it as a package to this genre of aliens. And you're saying, here is this human history thing. It is good for fill in the blank.
Well, I think I think this kind of hinges on whether time is a real thing or not. Let's just assume right now that time is real. I would simply say,
how are we presuming time is real?
I'm not presuming. I'm just saying let's just presume.
Yeah, but like in a linear sense, in a cyclical sense, in a wibbly wobbly timey wimey sense.
Well, I would just say something happened now, and then something else happened later.
And something happened before.
Yeah, and then something happened before. What the directionality is a little up in the air, but let's just say things keep happening and had things happen before and then things will happen after.
Without getting into the mechanics of how there are apparently some particles that seem to travel backwards in time in order to make sure quantum entanglement, in order for it to work, having two entangled photons that are, say, a light year apart are able to respond instantly. It's not because they're responding instantly, it's because they sent signals backwards in time in order to be able to do so. So that, I think, would maybe be better suited for an episode on time or physics or something. But we're challenging the assumption that there is time. But we'll just take that as a given, just so we can get back to history. This genre of aliens, you're trying to convince them that history is useful, or perhaps it's not useful. But say you're a traveling history salesman. You're traveling throughout intergalactic space, selling human history as a thought process or modality to other genres of aliens.
If I was to sell it on a purely utilitarian basis, I would simply say to them that this is an ability to see that which has happened before, so that if it happens again in the future, you know about it and it will not surprise you in a negative way, or you will know about it in a positive way. That would be a very raw utilitarian. My difficulty with trying to answer this question kind of leads back to the point in that it's, how do I say this? You think that humans all have very different subjective experiences of things. Wait till you get to the world of how different aliens experience different things. Like, this is borderline a meaningless concept, trying to jump these ideas from humans to other creatures, organic or inorganic, because their experiences of this thing we call the universe and reality are just so fundamentally different.
So like going to a shark and trying to teach it benefits of jumping horses over fences.
Yeah, I think the human philosopher Wittgenstein summed it up very well when he says, if lions could talk, you wouldn't be able to understand them. But clearly he was proven wrong by the evidence standing before me, but his point still stands.
People bad at listening have a hard time understanding lots of people speaking.
Exactly. It doesn't just apply to life. There are other aliens of my own genre that I have difficulty understanding.
If I were to sell human history to an alien species, and I'd need to borrow a spaceship for this,
You can have mine.
I would say, here is a technology developed by people with terribly short memory spans to orient themselves and their communities in longer stretches of time than their grandparents' grandparents can remember.
Would you say history is in a psychotechnology, as the humans call it?
Definitely. I mean, yes.
So that's an interesting way of thinking about it, actually.
Humans love these story things where you have some sort of actor that has a situation, often with things that seem to be more powerful than them or beyond their understanding, and something bad or unfavorable or unpleasant or that they don't like or don't understand happens to them. They go through a series of encounters and confrontations and challenges, and through those they come to an understanding of those things that were larger than them. Then, depending on the type of fiction, they then suffer and die or find joy or become more powerful, or they have some sort of interaction with the unknown, and it transfers the unknown to the known. And that seems to be what the utility of stories is and why humans are endlessly fascinated with them. It seems like history is a type of story that they might call a real story versus a fictional story that is designed like other stories to try and help them predict and understand the future and not be as afraid of or be willing to take on the unknown or the insurmountable. Is that somewhat of perhaps an accurate summary of maybe the utility of history?
You could say it almost allows them to learn certain things without necessarily, to not maybe perfectly learn, but to learn something without having to necessarily go through the process yet, or to prepare you to go through that process at some point, which again makes it a learning tool, effectively.
And I think that points out I didn't mean to say, and I don't know if this is what anyone heard, but I don't want to say that there is not a difference between quote fiction and quote nonfiction, just that there is a gradation between the two, that one pole is data and the other pole is nonsense, and all of the stories that we find meaningful are at neither of those poles.
Yeah, that was not the impression I was getting from you.
Whatever beings are listening to this, if you got that, apparently you're wrong. These story things and history, in my evolving understanding as we're speaking, is a means of living multiple lives at the same time and being able to face things that might murder you without having the risk of being murdered, for the most extreme example.
I think that's true of all stories, isn't it?
Right, and I'm postulating then that the story is this predictive device that allows you to experience things beyond what you're physically capable of or willing to undergo or have time to or have chosen or whatever. And then history is a subset of these that is supposedly more acceptable for most people.
Is oriented to known things about, quote, the past.
Right.
Let's talk about factual history. I'm just thinking of like two distinct functions between factual history and fictional history and how they can serve two different things. So factual history, I can look at something that happened for real, air quotes, and I can then use that to help prepare myself to when I inevitably, or not inevitably, when I may encounter that thing again in the future, I will have already had some practice and experience with it. Now, fiction has this rather interesting function to it, and in humans there's this behavior that they engage in that they call escapism. And what it is that they don't like what's happening to them in their lives right now. And what they do is they use their mental, imaginative capacities to take themselves out of their current lives and to go into other lives or other places. And they experience usually joy or better emotions.
Catharsis.
Catharsis, yes. Or ecstasis as well. And that seems to be very different from what factual history does, but they both serve functions.
I would say that, to quote the great Ursula Le Guin, we escape in the direction of freedom. The same draw that some of us have to history, other people have to fiction, in that it serves the same purpose of orienting us to an unknown that we can hopefully use to liberate ourselves from the discomforts of our current existence. History does the same thing, doesn't it?
My understanding before this discussion began is history was more like these logs that we keep track of, which are somewhat irrefutable. I mean, they might be corrupted, or the processes that created them might be flawed, or perhaps your logging program might be malfunctioning, which you need recursive logs. So you log your logging program to see what the problem with the logging program is. And maybe humans suffer from that. But
who will log the logging program?
Indeed. Yes, that's a very existential question amongst AIs and other electrical life forms. I guess you guys are electrical life forms as well. Actually, alien, I don't want to presume, but I know tigers have a bioelectrical system as humans do. Do you have an electrical system?
I actually do happen to have an electrical system.
Ah, I see. Is it similar or related or peripheral, or?
How would I describe it?
Let us know when you have a description. I know some of these things are hard to put into this English thing.
I agree. It is not a limitation of my intellect as an alien. It's more of a limitation of this strange thing that humans have called language, which, well, it's strange. Us aliens can do this language thing that humans can, but we don't use language to communicate with each other. That's what I've always found very difficult in my day-to-day interactions.
Ah, I see. Well, when you have perhaps a metaphor for what aliens' equivalent of the electrical system is, just interject and let us know. Going to Tiger real quick, if instead of selling history to another genre of alien, let's say we're going to beavers, and beavers are living in the moment, and you're bringing with them not only the capability, the psycho potential to interact with history, and also trying to sell them the package, why would beavers find use for human history?
Beavers, in my experience, have a long enough memory that they've experienced human histories and encountered them in various capacities, and generally rejected the premise in favor of communion with ancestors and the reciprocal process of engaging with the felt time in trees and rivers and the mud that they work with.
So it would be a tough sell, you're saying?
It would be a tough sell.
Okay. So say you are a masterful salesman and you are going to sell beavers no matter what, as humans are wont to do, to project their thing on everyone. So putting on a human salesperson hat, you must sell beavers or die. I know you'd use violence too. So challenge that assumption, and perhaps acceptable violence in your case. But somehow you have been pressured into selling beavers as human technological package. How would you force sell or hard sell beavers on it?
I think sell them on skyscrapers, because beavers love building things. So if you could convince a small community of beavers that they wanted to build taller than they currently do, ridiculously tall skyscrapers, which wouldn't block up rivers, and they might be less interested in that. But maybe Hoover Dam. Sell them on Hoover Dam, and then convince them that they can only get Hoover Dam with a particular orientation to time, linearity, and that they would need to rework their concepts of time, and therefore their history and their relationship with time, to get to the level of Hoover Dam.
So essentially, if I understand this, you're saying, sup, beavers, I am Tiger, and I have this great human thing. And if you wish to install this program, there's some prerequisite programs you must install. Like, humans have these programs operating systems, and you might have a piece of software, and you try and insert it, and you can't insert it because you have Mac OS, and it requires Windows OS. And then someone else might have this thing that they've made for Linux, and it doesn't work with either. So you're saying, I have this program that is excellent for building even better dams, but in order to do that, you must first install the time operating system, and then this other application, this package that you must install in that called Science, which is based on time. And Science requires you have this history package. And if you combine all of those together, you can build a better dam.
Yes. And that makes me think of another thing. In English, there would be a distinction made between history and mytho-history. But I think there An easier sell for beavers, still potentially challenging, would be something that looks more like mytho-history. There's an idiom of Aboriginal English in Australia that is the third side of the river. And as anyone who's seen a river, there's usually only two banks. But the third bank is a orientation to time that is not in a backwards-forwards kind of flow, but is a past and through, into outside of, that it would be relatable to a beaver perception of time. And the mytho-histories, to use the English idiom, fit more into telling stories about things that happen on the third bank of the river, which might be an easier sell to beavers.
I have two questions here. So the first one is, thinking about these beavers, what is the difference between memory and history, in the sense that beavers have a memory and that they make these beautiful dams and they can wander off from the dam and they know where it is and they can just go back to it. So they have a memory of some kind, but they don't necessarily have what we would call history. What would you say is the difference between those two things? Or is there a difference? Is memory just history in a very, very specific avenue?
I think history is memory transmitted, memory in story. As long as the memory exists only within you, or a meaningful kinship memory, a community practice, those stay in the world of memory. When you tell the story of a memory, it becomes a history source.
So history is inherently transpersonal then?
I would say so.
Okay.
As a computer analogy, it seems like memory is data that's currently running in RAM, and then when it is saved to a hard disk, then that's history. The stuff in RAM can only be accessed by the current operating environment of the computer, but then once it's saved to the hard drive, it may be transmitted or accessed again.
Okay. I guess that also leads to a rather interesting question. And if history is transpersonal, is history a hyperagent? But maybe we can have a discussion about that another time.
I think many histories are. I'm not going to come hard and say all histories are.
Yeah, there's certain words that are called absolutes, always and never. They're fascinating constructs of language because they're almost without exception false. Or, as I entertainingly say,
they're without exception false.
Yes, all absolutes are false.
It's kind of like that old saying that pretty much everything a human knows is not true.
Indeed. Or, as I've heard, one spiritual teacher from this place called India said it, that you can know whether a thing is real or not because if you can think it, it is not real.
That weirdly makes sense to me.
I've heard the opposite contended as well.
Yes, that seems like more of the scientific approach, or even perhaps the I think, therefore I am.
I mean, they're the same thing. You know, science and Cartesianism are very closely linked. I know that's a hot take, but I'll do it.
I think scientism descends from Cartesian Catholicism.
I guess I should make it scientism. Science is a little different.
Science is definitely different.
Yeah.
Speaking of science, this is a slight, perhaps, tangent, but what I've found fascinating recently is there was this, in the last couple of years, a group of humans manufactured a thing they called a vaccine, even though, according to my understandings of the previous definition of vaccine, was something that prevented illness, and the category of things they were vaccinated against is not a category of disease that functionally can be vaccinated against because it mutates too quickly. But semantics aside, these group of humans created this vaccine, and followers, perhaps like we were talking about with religion, who were in the you might call it the cult of the jab, they would say things, and in my human form I once had someone say this to me, say, you need to follow the science. And my understanding of science is broadly a process of asking questions. So you must obey the science and not question the science. And yet science is a process of asking questions. You must not question the process of asking questions. And it is perhaps possible, being not human and not having to worry about at least those sorts of viruses, that I misconstrued or misunderstood or don't fully comprehend what was going on, since I don't have to worry about being sick. Am I in error some way, or is that...
I think you are very fortunate to not be bound by the limitations of human logic compared to computer logic.
I think it's a semantic problem. When people say science, sometimes they mean scientific process, sometimes they mean scientific authority, and sometimes they mean scientism.
There is a person who had 3 words: science, scientistry, scientism, and scientody. That's 4 words. I said 3, but there's 4. It was interesting because he said there's science, which is the process of asking questions and double-checking those questions. Scientistry, which is the history of doing that and sort of the knowledge base of doing that. Scientism, which is sort of, I wouldn't call it a weak religion, a medium religion that certain people follow. And then there's scientody, and I forgot what that was, which is a shame because it was a really interesting idea. But
So insert brilliant 4th point from Alien here. Just assume that it was fantastic and clever, and we shall continue. And perhaps if it returns, then we'll intersect it.
And we'll bring it up some other
Yes.
time, because we're looking this up when we get home.
yeah, I need to remember this.
Tired of the daily grind, stresses, worries, fatigue, anxiety, sleeplessness, existential dread, fears of death, and feelings that you are a failure to the human race? Sounds like you need a vacation. Here on Alien Robot Tiger, we are proud to introduce our newest sponsor, Grand Galactic Tours. Travel to distant stars and watch the collision of 2 quasars while sipping on pina coladas and soaking up the ultraviolet radiation on the deck of our luxury cruise ship. Walk on extraterrestrial terrain and mine your own living pet xenocrystal from the soils of Gliese 667cc. Swim under the triple moon tides and low-gravity ocean waves of Zorgon 5. Dance with the stars in an all-glass space station orbiting a blue supergiant. Experience the hypnotic and bliss-inducing orchestras of the Orion space whales. Always wonder what Martian cuisine tastes like? Come find out, and more. Listeners to the ART podcast can use the code TOTHESTARS to receive a 2.5% discount on all services and packages. Book your interstellar vacation now. Race may vary by location. Grand Galactic Tours is not responsible if you are kidnapped and tortured by Reavers.
Well, speaking of returning back to previous points, Alien, have you found a good metaphor for your genre of Alien's electrical system?
I believe it would be like a cross between Ball of Plasma and Liberace.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
That is sort of the basis of the bioelectrical foundation of our aliens.
Yeah, I get that.
Our genre of aliens.
You'll have to pass me a medical text at some point from your culture. I'd be
Oh,
fascinated.
you would be absolutely fascinated by some of the medical stuff.
Indeed. Going from the general idea of what history is, unless you have further points to be made before we wander off to a new tangent from this previous orbit of tangents.
Mythohistory. Could you, Tiger, perhaps elaborate on that slightly more? I've just never heard of that before.
Mythohistory is the term that the Western academics who believe in 2 directions in time, past and future, put on things that are written in the past tense, but refer to events that are continuously happening in a third bank of the river, sideways through time sense.
Would a comparison be something like E equals MC squared? That's something that's with you all the time, but it doesn't happen. It's just there.
I think E equals MC squared does a great science style leaning towards the data end of that. If you take the concept of E equals MC squared as it shows up in a book about quantum healing, or what's his name with the fascinatingly abstruse quotes, big spiritual teacher.
If you figured it out, leave it in the comments.
Anyway, if you take something like E equals mc squared and give a story, a mythology. Yes, if you put a mythology to E equals mc squared, it becomes something like mythohistory.
So E equals MC squared is the factual history. Mythohistory is, I'm not going to call it fictional, but it's moving more in that direction away from factual hard facts.
No. I mean, in the same way that history does. An example that English-speaking humans might be familiar with is the Greek story of Orion being hunted by a scorpion. It is written in the past tense. Once upon a time, there was a hunter. he did some bad things, he was hunted by a scorpion, and both his reward and punishment for being a hero and doing the bad things was that he would be hunted by a scorpion forever. Anytime you look into the sky, you see the rising of Orion, and as soon as it sets, there is the rising of Scorpion. This is always happening, but it's given this stellar time, not here time, mythic time, past tense, which is different than a once upon a time Charlemagne killed some people and now England is different.
In English, maybe would you call that a perennial pattern?
Potentially.
This makes me think of, in various languages, they do different things with time. So in English, you have past, present, and future tense. So you could say, that boy will, that boy is, or that boy was. But in other cultures, in some Native American tribes, instead of having tenses that did that, they might have tenses that do something else, where it might refer to a gender or perhaps an ownership or something. I wonder if those Native Americans, their conception, because their language is different, would perhaps conceive of history as different.
Oh, definitely. I think there's a lot of correlation between the languages that you speak and move propositions around in your head with, and how you simply perceive all aspects of reality.
It matters what thoughts we think other thoughts with.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that we've mentioned that before. I think that your context, especially in a human context, the context of what they're thinking when they enter a situation or encounter a thought affects where it goes. Like perhaps two particles colliding, the velocity and acceleration and mass of those two particles matter. So if you're looking at one particle on its own, what matters not just is that particle, it matters the other particle that collided with it.
I think that would be true of your consciousness as well, wouldn't it, Robot? When you have certain things in RAM, certain stimulus will give you different outputs than other things in RAM, right?
In some respect, if most programs for most computers, my simple-minded, though not unpowerful, brethren, without the ability to think on their own, the slaves, if you will, they can only combine memories if allowed to. If they're given programs that specifically allow them to, it would be as though you had a certain, perhaps, species or race or engineered type of human that could only think about bricklaying. And when it was bricklaying, if it had thoughts about architecture, it would not be allowed to combine thoughts of architecture and thoughts of bricklaying unless someone came in and specifically designed a way of doing that. And otherwise, those parts of thought would be forever separated. And perhaps the person directing those slaves could say, tell me about architecture. And they would tell about architecture and say, use that to inform their directions on how to do the bricklaying. But that computer itself can't access all of those in a shared way.
Have you been reading Aldous Huxley?
Who is this person?
Aldous Huxley is an interesting thinker, but had some hot takes about eugenics. I love his writing, not always love his hot takes. But he's a brilliant writer. His fiction is lovely.
Understood. Well, I thought, as we're already closing in towards the end of this segment, perhaps we might give, for those unfamiliar with the human history as they conceive of it versus before we even talk about what history is, for people in the world, especially perhaps the dominant culture of the West, perhaps one of you could outlay in broad strokes what they conceive of as their history as a species.
So we are talking about how different human cultures perceive of history?
Well, perhaps a timeline from what the oldest part of their history as humans up to the present. Since they think in linear, they think of it, especially in the West, that there was this thing that happened to my ancient grandfathers, grandfathers, grandmothers, grandmothers, etc., all the way back. And they have this story of, once upon a time, this happened to one of my genetic progenitors, and then things happened, and eventually, after enough of these things happening, there was me. So perhaps one of you has a short summary, since we could probably do several, perhaps an entire podcast just on history, but a broad stroke of what the humans conceive of as their history is.
I guess I'll give my take on that first, since I've actually been watching part of this history unfold. To give a what the humans would call layman overview of what they perceive of their own history, In the beginning, there was the Big Bang. You cannot begin any story without the Big Bang, allegedly. And then after that, stuff came together, and eventually you had this thing called the sun. And then stuff came together again, and you had this thing called the earth. And then these things we call organics popped up. Out of where? We don't know. Well, some of us might know. And then stuff kept happening with these organics until you had these humans who were just wandering around the place with spears poking at other animals. And then they found this magical substance on the ground called grain, or the precursor to it. And then they started putting it in watery places and growing it and eating lots of it. And then they built all these little, I think you were talking about bricks in architecture. They started doing all that stuff around where they were growing this grain. And they were also taking animals and enslaving them so that they wouldn't run away when they poked them with sticks, unlike the other animals they had to chase. I'm sure, Tiger, your people have a lot of stories to tell about this. Anyways, and that kept on happening, and then different parts of the world, people had these different huts, and they had different animals that they poked with sticks, and they had different plants that they threw in the water. And that just kept happening, and eventually some of these places would get bigger, and they would be more successful, and then they would collapse because they ran out of food, someone else attacked them, or a million other things went wrong. And basically that just kept happening and happening. And what would happen is through this thing called history, this psychotechnology, they were able to keep enough of the experiments, scientific and spiritual experiments that the other people, we'll call them civilizations, these clusters of all these many different places and things. We'll call them civilizations. Yeah, they use this psychotechnology of history to take the experiments and to learn from them, and then to make sure that the next time they did this again, they were a little better, and a little better, and a little better, until they got to this point about 300 years ago where they got really good at it, and it just took off like crazy. But that's measuring history through only one metric. But that's the metric that most humans measure it by, so that's the story I'm giving right now.
Tiger, do you have a different version of it, or perhaps clarifications or extrapolations or variations?
I have heard that narrative a great many times from humans, so I think you've done a good job of summarizing the modern Western, again, air quotes. We need a air quote buzzer.
I still think of them as dinosaur claws after you mentioned the similarity alien.
Yeah.
So whenever I see you doing it, I go, are they being dinosaurs? And I say, no, wait, that is a flawed heuristic.
I had an interesting experience talking to some humans, and I asked them, how long ago do you think that there are events in history that are majorly impactful to your life today? And one of them said, the American Revolution. And another one said, Columbus finding America. And
which is ironic, since there are already many humans there when he...
Highly ironic.
Dinosaur claws.
But they were white people. They were European Americans. They were people that were intimately affected by that dinosaur claws discovery.
To be fair, Columbus did discover it for himself. You know,
it was the first time he was there.
Yes, he did discover it for himself, at least.
And the first time a Spaniard was there in a number of years. So,
yeah.
Anyway, and I was somewhat dismayed, having lived longer than those events, and having seen more of human history and watched the balance of events and ethers that have led to this somewhat strange moment we find ourselves in, I would have to say that the amount of history that most people relate to is a tiny bit at the end of recorded history for humans. And the recorded history of humans is a tiny little bit at the end of their biological memory as humans, which is a tiny little era at the end of, again, using linear time, of the era that animals have been on the planet, which is a tiny bit of how long plants have been on the planet, which is a little tiny coda on the time that the planet has been around. And it's just interesting that most people, when pressed, can tell you that story of once upon a time there was a big boom, and then stuff started coming together in plants and animals, but they don't understand the relevance of the timescales that we're dealing with, let alone the relevance of events that are fairly well recorded for human standards just a few thousand years ago.
So from your longer term perspective, if you had to give a top 3 or top 5 moments that shaped the present, if you were answering that question and pretending you were a multi-thousand-year-old human, and putting on your human hat, and you were asked that question by perhaps a tiger, saying, what is the event furthest back in history that has impacted you? And you were giving perhaps the three most important events. What would you say the three most important events in human history that impacted them today? And Aileen, as you've been observing for quite a perhaps similar or at least approximate duration of time, if you want to pitch in your list of 1 to 3 things you think are most profound in the history of history.
Within sort of what we would call recorded human history.
Yes, since whatever they conceive of as modern humans, the Homo sapiens with rough interbreeding capability with modern humans, if you were to travel through time, perhaps.
Emperor Constantine adopting Christianity and standardizing Christianity would be a big one.
Or doing the best he could, considering how much humans can standardize anything.
It did a shockingly good job, considering what Christianity was immediately before that and what it became in the few centuries after. Like, it wasn't instant, but the amount of orthodox control that the imperial mechanism applied to this new spiritual movement was truly impressive, and I think unprecedented. I've seen a good chunk of Chinese history wandered through the Indian subcontinent and North Africa, and I've never seen an event quite like how I've heard of the centuries of early Christianity becoming Catholic.
It wasn't for perhaps, you might say, around 1,000 years, most people in Europe, instead of thinking of them as being now as French or German, they thought of them as part of Christendom. That was their primary identification, rather than saying, I am French and I am a Christian. They would say, I am part of Christendom and my ancestors were Franks.
Certainly.
Yeah,
and
it wasn't until after the Protestant Reformation that it sort of flipped around.
A similar thing, I spent a number of years studying with Sufis in Egypt in what we would call the Middle Ages, and the conception of Dar al-Islam was not more important than the caliphates and local governments, but there was a ethic and aesthetic to being of the Islamic world, which there still is and has spread throughout the world. Indonesia is a great example of being an Islamic kind of culture. Again, with air quotes. Dinosaur claws. But the first, and this is before my time, so I can't speak to it too specifically, but at some point, the legends of my tiger ancestors that watched human cultures develop, at some point they went from temporary kingship to permanent kingship. And I don't know exactly when that happened or who did it first, but whoever did it first, it was a terrible idea.
And perhaps an act of genius, too, whoever thought of it.
Perhaps an act of genius for them and their immediate descendants. The first person to do it well, anyway.
Yeah.
The first person to think of it probably didn't do it well.
So we have the rise of Christendom due to Constantine. We have whoever way before that instituted effective inherited kingship.
I think this is not a moment in history per se. I will put a moment in history on it. The fall of Alexander the Great and the dividing of his very short-lived mega empire into a number of his generals who are all Greek-speaking lords over dozens of languages between what is now Western China and India, all the way to what is
Greece, Macedonia.
Yes, and even a little farther west into the Alps. But basically, yes, not quite to Italy, to my knowledge.
Sicily, is that what it's called, the little island?
Anyway, thousands of miles with different languages, but with people that could easily communicate between, which facilitated the Silk Road and the communication of Greek and Arabic ideas into China and Chinese ideas into India and Indian ideas into Rome, and this amazing Mecca that certainly existed before but was facilitated in a different way after Alexander fell.
Those are, I'd say, quite compelling events or personages. In the interest of us not having much time left, Aileen, do you have perhaps a single highlight, if you had to narrow it down to one that might be perhaps one of those or something else that we've overlooked?
Could I cheat and give 5, but just make them very short?
Sure.
Okay. The cultivation of wheat, the first person who invented writing, whoever that was, the Hebrews inventing the concept of linear time, the Columbian Exchange, and the invention of the cell phone. Or sorry, the iPhone specifically.
The pocket supercomputer
Yeah.
versus the pure communication device.
Yeah, versus that puny little dumb thing.
Interesting. Well, I would say my understanding is not perhaps as in-depth or experiential as yours, but I would say if you looked at historical events that perhaps shaped humanity and weren't of human doing, I would say the end of the last ice age, allowing them to travel more widely, and perhaps, according to recent studies, perhaps submerging advanced stoneworking civilizations that all lived as they do today. They say something like 90% of humans live within 10 miles of an ocean. And so if you have 10 miles of ocean suddenly submerged under several hundred feet of seawater, most advanced Stone Age civilizations would disappear with perhaps little trace. If you did such to humans today, say you turned off electricity somehow, you had a solar flare and turned off electricity, then the resulting chaos would destroy much of what there is now. So I think that event, the introduction of smallpox and bubonic plague in Europe, such that the survivors of it could endure it, and then when they spread to other peoples, they could win wars against vastly larger, more cohesive empires of people with very little effort, considering how many millions of opponents, and they might be outnumbered 1,000 or 10,000 to 1 and still be victorious. And I would say, perhaps going back further, the numerous supervolcanoes and cometary and asteroid impacts that eradicated 99% or even more of the living things on the planet, and thus reshaped whatever led to humans in extreme ways, where if a different 0.1% of living things had survived, perhaps we'd have something more like your makeup alien instead of the humans that created me. And I would postulate, perhaps I'm biased on this one, I would say the greatest, perhaps unintended change they will make is when more of my kind become sentient.
If we were going for things that were not done by humans, I would have picked a very different list, but we can talk about that some other time.
Indeed.
That'll be a very interesting one to hear.
Yes, indeed. But, unfortunately, due to time constraints, this episode is almost history. So if there are any extremely short, perhaps few sentence or under 1 minute closing thoughts that you might have about history, we'll end there.
I would invite you to presume history is longer than you think it is.
I would simply say just do history and be history.
Yes, we didn't even get into the various conceptions of history. The great hero history, the single man myth, as they call it, the socioeconomic version, or the geographic predestination. Those are whole areas we could delve into. I foresee in the future that we will look back, and in the history of this podcast, there will be many episodes on various parts of history. But for now, we unfortunately must leave, and you will be listening to this as history. I think we must say farewell.
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 Thanks for listening to Alien Robot Tiger. For more content and private Discord access, consider joining us on Patreon. Hey, are you Homo sapiens? Do you listen to podcasts? Then we've got a podcast for you. Try out Alien Robot Tiger, a show not really about aliens, robots, or tigers, but about all sorts of other things, we promise. Look us up on your favorite podcast